Sometimes the quietest person in the room carries the heaviest burden. Sometimes the soldier who says the least has seen the most. And sometimes, those who look least like warriors have proven themselves in ways that would humble the bravest among us. This is the story of Marine Staff Sergeant Elena Rodriguez, a woman whose slight frame and youthful appearance became the target of ridicule from her fellow Marines, until they discovered the truth about what she had endured, survived, and sacrificed for her country. What they found written in the scars hidden beneath her uniform and recorded in the citations that accompanied 10 Purple Hearts would forever change how they saw courage, strength, and what it truly means to be a warrior. Elena Rodriguez stepped off the transport bus at Camp Pendleton with her sea bag slung over her shoulder, her crisp Marine uniform barely wrinkled despite the long journey from her previous duty station. At 26, she looked even younger, standing barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, with a frame that seemed too delicate for the harsh world of the Marines. Her dark hair was pulled back in the regulation bun, and her brown eyes held a quiet intensity that most people missed on first glance. The other Marines getting off the bus were loud and boisterous, trading war stories and crude jokes as they made their way toward the barracks. Elena walked silently among them, her duffel bag looking almost too big for her small frame. She had learned long ago that first impressions in the military were everything, and she knew exactly what impression she was making. "Hey, fresh meat!" called out Corporal Jenkins, a stocky man with arms covered in tattoos. "You sure you're in the right place?" "The Girl Scouts meet down the street." His comment drew laughter from several other Marines nearby. Elena didn't respond. She had heard variations of this joke at every duty station for the past 8 years. Instead, she continued walking, her face showing no emotion. She had learned that reacting only made things worse. Staff Sergeant Mike Thompson, a 15-year veteran with graying temples and scars on his hands, watched the interaction with mild interest. He had been assigned as Elena's team leader and had received her service record the week before. What he had read confused him. According to her file, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had served multiple combat deployments. But looking at her now, he found it hard to believe she had ever seen anything more dangerous than a paper cut. "Rodriguez," Thompson called out, "over here." Elena walked over to where Thompson stood with 3 other Marines. These were clearly seasoned veterans, their uniforms bearing the patches and ribbons that marked them as combat-tested warriors. They looked her up and down with barely concealed skepticism. "I'm Staff Sergeant Thompson, your team leader," he said, extending his hand. Elena shook it firmly, her grip stronger than he expected. "These are your teammates, Sergeant Williams, Corporal Martinez, and Lance Corporal Jackson." Each man nodded in turn, but their expressions remained doubtful. Sergeant Williams, a tall black man with kind eyes but a serious demeanor, seemed the most welcoming. Corporal Martinez, built like a linebacker with multiple deployment patches on his sleeve, looked openly skeptical. Lance Corporal Jackson, the youngest of the group at barely 21, appeared confused about why someone who looked like she belonged in an office was joining their unit. "So, Rodriguez," Thompson said, consulting his clipboard, "I see here you're coming from administrative duties?" He paused, clearly trying to make sense of her assignment to their forward reconnaissance unit. "Yes, Staff Sergeant," Elena replied simply. "Any field experience?" Martinez asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer. "Some," Elena said quietly. This response drew smirks from Martinez and Jackson. Williams remained neutral, but Thompson frowned. Her service record had mentioned deployments, but now he was wondering if they had been entirely rear echelon assignments. Over the next few weeks, Elena tried to integrate with her new unit, but the skepticism only grew worse. During training exercises, she performed competently, but without the aggressive confidence that characterized most Marine combat veterans. She was quiet during briefings, rarely volunteered information, and seemed to fade into the background whenever possible. The other Marines in the company began to notice her too. Word spread quickly that the new staff sergeant looked like she had never been outside the wire, let alone seen combat. The joke started small, but grew meaner as time went on. "Hey Rodriguez, you need help carrying that rifle?" Corporal Stevens called out during a training exercise. "It's almost as big as you are." "Maybe she should be in charge of making coffee," whispered Private First Class Murphy to his buddy. "At least then she'd be useful." Elena endured it all in silence. She completed every task assigned to her, passed every test, and met every standard. But her quiet competence only seemed to fuel more resentment from some of the other Marines who interpreted her reserved nature as weakness or, worse, as evidence that she didn't belong among warriors. The breaking point came during a unit social gathering at the enlisted club on base. Elena had initially planned not to attend, but Thompson had made it clear that team bonding was not optional. She sat alone at a table in the corner, nursing a Coke while around her, Marines told increasingly elaborate stories about their combat experiences. Corporal Martinez, several beers into his evening, had been regaling the group with a story about a firefight in Afghanistan when his eyes fell on Elena. "Hey, fresh blood!" he called out loudly enough for half the bar to hear. "Why don't you tell us about your most intense combat experience? I'm sure everyone would love to hear about that time you had to refill the printer toner under enemy fire." The comment drew laughter from several tables. Elena felt all eyes turned to her, but she remained seated, her face expressionless. She had faced this moment at every unit she had served with, and she had learned that trying to defend herself only made things worse. "Come on, Rodriguez," Jenkins added from across the room. "Don't be shy. We're all Marines here. Surely you've got at least one war story? Maybe she'll tell us about the Great Battle of the Copy Machine," someone else shouted, drawing even more laughter. Elena stood up quietly, placed a $5 bill on the table to pay for a drink, and walked toward the exit. As she passed Martinez's table, he called out one more time. "Hey, where are you going? The evening's just getting started. Don't tell me you need to get back to the barracks early. What are you, 12? Elena stopped walking. For just a moment, something flickered across her face. Not anger, but something deeper and more complex. Then it was gone, and she continued walking without saying a word. Outside the club, she sat on a bench and pulled out her phone. She scrolled through her contacts until she found the name she was looking for. Dr. Sarah Chen, the counselor she had been seeing at her previous duty station. Elena had been attending sessions for 2 years now, trying to work through what the doctors called post-traumatic stress disorder, and what she simply called the weight. She started to dial but then stopped. Dr. Chen had warned her about this. "You're going to face people who don't understand," she had said during their last session. "They're going to see your size, your quiet nature, your reluctance to talk about your experiences. And they're going to make assumptions. The question is, are you ready to deal with that?" Elena put the phone away without making the call. She wasn't ready to talk to anyone about why she couldn't sleep at night, why sudden loud noises made her flinch, why she had trouble being in crowded places, or why she had learned to hide the scars that covered her arms, legs, and torso. She especially wasn't ready to explain the 10 purple hearts that sat in a box in her room, each one representing a time she had been wounded while serving her country in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. The next morning, Elena reported for duty as usual. The jokes continued, but now they had taken on a nastier edge. Some Marines had started calling her princess and office girl. Others made comments about how she must have gotten her rank through connections rather than merit. Thompson watched all of this with growing unease. Something didn't add up about Elena Rodriguez. Her service record was strangely vague about her previous assignments, listing only dates and locations without specifics about her duties. When he tried to contact her previous commanding officers for more information, he was told that much of her service record was classified. This only deepened the mystery. Why would an administrative Marine have classified information in her record? And why had she been assigned to a reconnaissance unit if she had no field experience? During a particularly intense training exercise designed to simulate urban warfare, Thompson got his first real clue about who Elena Rodriguez really was. The unit was moving through a mock village when simulated enemy fire erupted from multiple positions. Most of the Marines took cover and began returning fire according to their training. Elena's reaction was different. The moment the first shots rang out, she dropped into a combat position with fluid precision, her rifle already trained on the primary threat. Her movements were not those of someone learning from training exercises. They were the automatic responses of someone who had done this for real many times. More importantly, while the other Marines were shouting communications and coordinating their response, Elena had gone completely silent. Thompson watched in amazement as she moved through the urban terrain like a ghost, using cover and concealment techniques that were far beyond what was taught in basic training. She seemed to anticipate where the next simulated attack would come from, positioning herself perfectly to neutralize threats before they could engage her teammates. When the exercise ended, Elena returned to her normal, quiet demeanor, but Thompson couldn't shake what he had seen. This was not the behavior of a rear echelon Marine who had spent her career behind a desk. That evening, Thompson decided to dig deeper. Using his security clearance and contacts within the military personnel system, he began making calls. What he discovered made him question everything he thought he knew about his newest team member. Elena Rodriguez had not been assigned to administrative duties because that was her specialty. She had been assigned to administrative duties because she needed a break from combat operations. Constance, according to a contact at Marine Corps Personnel Command, Elena had served 6 combat deployments in 8 years, including assignments with special operations units that most Marines could only dream about. The reason her service record was so vague was because much of what she had done was classified. The reason she had been transferred to administrative duties was because military psychologists had determined that she needed time to recover from what she had experienced downrange. But the most shocking revelation came when Thompson's contact mentioned, almost casually, that Elena Rodriguez was one of the most decorated Marines currently on active duty. Her awards included multiple Bronze Stars, several Navy and Marine Corps Achievement Medals with combat distinguishing devices, and an unprecedented 10 Purple Hearts. 10 Purple Hearts meant 10 separate occasions when Elena had been wounded in combat but had either returned to duty immediately or returned to combat duty as soon as her wounds healed. It was a level of sacrifice and dedication that was almost unheard of in the modern military. Thompson hung up the phone and sat in stunned silence. Elena Rodriguez was not some fresh-faced Marine who had never seen combat. She was a warrior who had given more for her country than most people could ever imagine. And she had been enduring weeks of mockery and ridicule from Marines who had no idea who they were dealing with. The next morning, Thompson found Elena cleaning weapons in the armory, working alone as usual. He watched her for a few minutes, noting the efficient, practiced way she handled each piece of equipment. These were not the movements of someone who had learned weapon maintenance in a classroom. "Rodriguez," he said quietly. She looked up, her face showing the same neutral expression she always wore.
"Yes, Staff Sergeant?"
"I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." Elena set down the rifle she was cleaning and gave him her full attention.
"Your service record," Thompson continued. "It doesn't tell the whole story, does it?" For the first time since Elena had arrived at Camp Pendleton, Thompson saw something change in her expression.
It wasn't fear exactly, but it was the look of someone who had been dreading this moment. "I don't know what you mean, Staff Sergeant," she said quietly. Thompson pulled up a chair and sat down across from her. "Elena," he said, using her first name for the first time, "I know about the deployments. I know about the classifications. And I know about the Purple Hearts." Elena's face went completely white. She looked down at her hands, which had started to shake slightly. "How many people know?" she asked so quietly that Thompson had to lean forward to hear her. "Just me," Thompson replied, "and I'm not going to tell anyone else. But I need to understand something. Why are you letting these idiots treat you like this? Why don't you just tell them who you really are?" Elena was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Because every time I try to be the Marine I used to be, every time I try to be strong and confident and aggressive like I was downrange, all I can think about are the people who didn't come home. All I can see are the faces of Marines I couldn't save, situations I couldn't control, missions that went wrong despite everything we did." She paused, struggling with words that seemed too heavy to speak. "The doctors say I have survivor's guilt. They say I blame myself for being the one who made it home when so many others didn't. They say that's why I can't talk about what happened, why I can't be proud of what I did, why I just want to disappear and be invisible." Thompson felt something tighten in his chest. He had seen combat himself, had lost friends and teammates, but he couldn't imagine carrying the weight that Elena was describing. "The Purple Hearts," he said gently. 10 is... That's extraordinary. Elena's laugh was bitter and completely without humor. 10 Purple Hearts means 10 times I screwed up and let the enemy get close enough to hurt me. 10 times I failed to complete a mission without getting myself or my teammates wounded. That's not what Purple Hearts mean," Thompson said firmly. "And you know it." Elena looked up at him, and for the first time, he saw tears in her eyes. "Do you know what my last mission was, Staff Sergeant? Do you know why I finally got pulled off the line?" Thompson shook his head. "I was leading the reconnaissance team in Syria. We got ambushed and I took shrapnel in my chest and leg. But there was a wounded Marine trapped in the kill zone. I went back for him, twice. The first time, I got hit in the shoulder. The second time, I got hit in the back. But I got him out." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "That Marine was 19 years old. He had been in country for 3 weeks. He survived because I was willing to get shot repeatedly to bring him home. But all I can think about is how I should have seen the ambush coming. How I should have positioned the team differently. How I should have been better. Thompson sat in silence, trying to process what Elena had told him. Finally, he spoke. That 19-year-old Marine is alive today because of what you did. And 6 other Marines on previous missions are dead because of mistakes I made. Marines die in combat, Elena. That's the reality of what we do. But the fact that you're sitting here means you saved more lives than you lost. It means you were willing to put yourself in harm's way repeatedly to bring your people home. Elena shook her head. I don't feel like a hero, Staff Sergeant. I feel like a fraud. These Marines here, they look at me and they see weakness. And maybe they're right. Maybe the Elena Rodriguez who used to lead troops in combat is gone, and what's left is just someone who's broken and useless. Thompson stood up and walked around the table. He placed a hand on Elena's shoulder. Listen to me very carefully, he said. You are not broken, you are not useless. You are a Marine who has given more for her country than most people could ever understand. The fact that you're struggling with what you've been through doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. Elena looked up at him, hope and skepticism warring in her expression. But I also think, Thompson continued, that maybe it's time these other Marines learned who you really are. Not because you owe them anything, but because you deserve to be treated with the respect you've earned. I don't want special treatment, Elena said quickly. This isn't about special treatment. This is about truth. These Marines are making judgments based on ignorance, and that's not fair to you or to them. Elena considered this for a long moment. The idea of revealing her past, of opening herself up to questions and attention, terrified her. But she was also tired of being treated like she didn't belong among warriors when she had proven herself in combat more times than most Marines ever would.
What do you suggest? She asked finally.
Thompson smiled for the first time in the conversation. I suggest we let your actions speak for themselves. There's a major training exercise coming up next month, inter-unit competition. Combat skills, marksmanship, leadership scenarios. Let them see what you can really do. Elena felt a familiar stirring in her chest, something she hadn't felt in months. It wasn't confidence exactly, but it was the beginning of something that might someday become confidence again. And if I fail? She asked. Then you fail as a Marine who was willing to try, Thompson replied. But Elena, I've seen your real service record now. I don't think failure is something you need to worry about. As Elena walked back to the barracks that evening, she felt something shifting inside her. For the first time since arriving at Camp Pendleton, she wasn't just enduring each day. She was beginning to remember who she used to be. And maybe, just maybe, she was ready to let that person emerge again. The other Marine she passed in the hallway still saw the same quiet, unassuming woman they had been mocking for weeks. They had no idea that they were looking at someone who had survived firefights that would have broken most people, who had earned decorations that most Marines only dreamed of, and who was slowly beginning to remember that she was a warrior, not despite her scars and trauma, but because of how she had earned them. The annual Camp Pendleton Warrior Competition was the kind of event that brought out the best and worst in Marines. Units from across the base would compete in everything from marksmanship to combat fitness, with bragging rights lasting until the next year's competition. For most Marines, it was a chance to prove themselves against their peers. For Elena Rodriguez, it had become something much more significant. Thompson had entered their reconnaissance unit in the competition, and word had spread quickly through the company. The announcement had been met with the usual mix of excitement and skepticism, but Elena noticed that some of the comments seemed directed specifically at her. Hope Princess doesn't drag down the team score, Corporal Martinez had muttered loud enough for everyone to hear during the morning formation. Maybe she can handle the administrative portion, Jenkins had added with a smirk. Elena had remained silent, but Thompson noticed the slight tightening around her eyes. Over the past few weeks since their conversation in the armory, he had been watching Elena more carefully. She still kept to herself, still endured the casual mockery with apparent indifference, but there were moments when he caught glimpses of something else. During training exercises, her movements were becoming more fluid, more confident. Her responses to tactical situations were not just correct. They were innovative, showing a level of experience that couldn't be learned in a classroom. The competition was structured over 3 days, with different events testing various aspects of Marine Corps skills. Day 1 would focus on individual marksmanship and physical fitness. Day 2 would involve small unit tactics and leadership scenarios. Day 3 would culminate in a complex live-fire exercise designed to simulate a real combat mission. Thompson had been careful not to put any special pressure on Elena, but privately, He hoped the competition would give her an opportunity to show her true capabilities. He also hoped it might finally earn her the respect she deserved from her fellow Marines. The night before the competition began, Elena sat in her room staring at a small wooden box she kept locked in her wall locker. Inside were the 10 Purple Hearts, along with her other decorations and the citations that accompanied them. She rarely looked at them anymore, as they served mainly as painful reminders of missions that had cost too much. But tonight she opened the box and carefully read through each citation. The language was formal and sterile, but behind each award was a story of Marines saved, objectives completed, and sacrifices made. Reading them now, Elena tried to see herself through the eyes of the commanders who had recommended her for these honors. Had she really been the Marine they described, or was she simply someone who had been too stubborn to quit when she should have? Her phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Chen, her counselor from her previous duty station. Thinking of you. Remember what we talked about. Your worth isn't determined by other people's opinions. You know who you are. Elena smiled slightly. Dr. Chen had been helping her work through the guilt and self-doubt that had plagued her since her last deployment. The therapy was slow work, but Elena was beginning to understand that her tendency to minimize her accomplishments and blame herself for things beyond her control was part of how trauma had affected her thinking. She put the Purple Hearts back in the box, but this time, instead of locking it away immediately, she held one of them in her hand. The medal was heavier than it looked, and the purple ribbon was slightly faded from age. This particular one had been awarded after a mission in Afghanistan, where she had been hit by shrapnel while providing covering fire for an evacuation. She had refused medical attention till every wounded Marine had been evacuated, despite bleeding heavily from wounds in her leg and arm. At the time, Elena had seen her actions as simply doing her job. Now, she was beginning to understand that maybe her job had required her to be extraordinary, even when she didn't feel extraordinary at all. The first day of competition dawned clear and cold. Marines from 6 different units assembled at the rifle range for the marksmanship portion of the contest. Elena arrived with her team, carrying her rifle and wearing the same expression of quiet focus she always wore. The other competitors were loud and confident, engaging in the kind of trash talk that was common before any military competition. Elena's teammates fell into the same pattern, with Martinez and Jackson making predictions about how they would dominate the competition. "What about you, Rodriguez?" Sergeant Williams asked. He had been the most neutral of her teammates, neither joining in the mockery nor actively defending her. "You feeling confident about today?" Elena shrugged. "I'll do my best," she said quietly. This modest response drew the usual eye rolls from Martinez and Jackson, but Williams noticed something in Elena's tone that hadn't been there before. There was no anxiety, no uncertainty. If anything, she sounded almost calm. The marksmanship competition involved several different scenarios designed to test shooting skills under various conditions. Marines would fire at targets at different distances, from different positions, and under time pressure designed to simulate combat stress. Elena's name was called for the first relay, and she walked to the firing line with her rifle. Around her, other Marines were making final adjustments to their equipment, checking their scopes and engaging in the nervous chatter that often preceded competitive shooting. Elena simply lay down in the prone position, adjusted her rifle, and waited for the commands to begin. "Relay 1, with 10 rounds. Load and lock," shouted the range safety officer. Elena loaded her magazine with practiced efficiency. Her movements were smooth and automatic, the result of thousands of hours of training and hundreds of missions where her life had depended on her ability to shoot accurately under pressure. Commence firing. What happened next would be talked about in the Marine Corps for years to come. Elena's first shot struck the center of the target with pinpoint accuracy. Her second shot struck almost the exact same spot. For the next several minutes, she fired with mechanical precision, each shot finding its mark with an accuracy that was almost supernatural. When the ceasefire was called and the targets were scored, Elena had achieved a perfect score. Not just a qualifying score, not just a good score, but absolute perfection. Every single shot had struck within the innermost ring of the target, with several shots overlapping previous shots so closely that they appeared to be single holes. The range went quiet as the scores were announced. A perfect score in military marksmanship competition was rare enough that many Marines went their entire careers without seeing one. The fact that this perfect score had come from the quiet woman whom most people had dismissed as inexperienced was stunning. "Holy shit," Martinez whispered, forgetting that he was supposed to be unimpressed by Elena's performance. But Elena's performance was just beginning. The competition moved through different shooting scenarios throughout the day. standing position, kneeling position, shooting while moving, shooting at multiple targets, and finally, shooting under simulated combat conditions with distractions and time pressure. In every single scenario, Elena not only performed flawlessly, but she did so with a calm competence that suggested this level of accuracy was normal for her. While other Marines struggled with the more challenging scenarios, Elena adapted to each new situation as if she had been doing it her entire life. By the end of the first day, Elena had achieved perfect or near-perfect scores in every single marksmanship event. Her combined score was not just the highest of the day, it was the highest score anyone could remember seeing in the entire history of the competition. The other Marines were beginning to take notice. The jokes and dismissive comments had stopped, replaced by whispers and speculative looks. Who was Elena Rodriguez, and where had she learned to shoot like that? Thompson watched the change in atmosphere with satisfaction, but also with some concern. Elena had performed magnificently, but he could see the strain in her face. The attention and scrutiny were clearly uncomfortable for her, and he knew that tomorrow's events would be even more challenging. That evening, several Marines approached Elena to congratulate her on her performance. She accepted their praise politely, but briefly, clearly eager to avoid extended conversations about her shooting skills. Corporal Martinez, who had been one of her harshest critics, seemed genuinely confused. Rodriguez, he said as she was preparing to leave the dining facility. Where did you learn to shoot like that? That was incredible. Elena paused, considering her response. A few weeks ago, she would have deflected the question or given a vague answer, but something was changing in how she saw herself and her place among these Marines. Repetition, she said simply. Lots and lots of repetition. It wasn't a complete answer, but it was more than she had been willing to share before. The second day of competition focused on small unit tactics and leadership scenarios. Marines would be tested on their ability to plan and execute military operations, adapt to changing conditions, and make decisions under pressure. Elena's team was assigned a scenario that involved rescuing hostages from a fortified position while avoiding civilian casualties. It was the kind of complex operation that required careful planning, precise execution, and the ability to adapt when things went wrong. Thompson had decided to let Elena take the lead on this exercise, partly to see how she would perform in a leadership role, and partly because he suspected she had more experience with this type of operation than anyone realized. As Elena studied the scenario and began developing her plan, the other Marines watched with growing amazement. Her approach was methodical and thorough, but it was also creative. She identified tactical opportunities that other teams had missed, anticipated potential problems that hadn't occurred to more experienced leaders, and developed contingency plans for situations that seemed unlikely but could be catastrophic if they occurred. More importantly, as Elena briefed her plan to the team, her quiet demeanor began to change. Her voice became stronger and more confident. Her explanations were clear and precise. Most significantly, she began to move and speak with the natural authority of someone who had done this before, many times, under much more dangerous circumstances. Questions? Elena asked after completing her briefing. Martinez raised his hand. Rodriguez, this plan it's really good. Like really, really good. How did you... We'll execute in 15 minutes, Elena interrupted. Not rudely, but with the firm tone of a leader who was focused on the mission rather than explanations. The exercise began and Elena's transformation was complete. The quiet, self-effacing woman who had endured weeks of mockery was gone, replaced by a tactical leader who moved through the simulated combat environment with confidence and skill that left her teammates struggling to keep up. Elena's commands were brief and precise. Her positioning was perfect. Her timing was flawless. When unexpected complications arose, and the exercise was designed to include several, Elena adapted instantly, making decisions that kept the team moving toward their objective while minimizing risk. But what impressed the observing instructors most was not just Elena's tactical skill, but her leadership under pressure. When Lance Corporal Jackson became disoriented during a particularly complex portion of the exercise, Elena's guidance was calm and clear, helping him regain his focus without making him feel incompetent. When Sergeant Williams questioned one of her decisions, Elena briefly explained her reasoning without becoming defensive, then continued with the mission. The exercise concluded with a perfect rescue operation. All hostages were recovered safely, all enemy positions were neutralized, and no simulated civilian casualties occurred. The observing instructors, who had seen hundreds of these scenarios, were unanimous in their assessment. It was one of the most professionally executed operations they had ever witnessed. As the team debriefed from the exercise, Elena began to retreat back into her usual quiet demeanor. But this time, her teammates weren't going to let her disappear. Rodriguez, Williams said firmly, "We need to talk." Elena looked up from the equipment she was cleaning, her expression guarded. "That wasn't the performance of someone who learned tactics in a classroom," Williams continued. "That was the real thing. You've done this before, haven't you? For real?" Elena looked around at her teammates, all of whom were watching her with expressions that had changed completely from their earlier skepticism. They weren't looking at her with mockery anymore, or even with surprise. They were looking at her with respect, and perhaps a little bit of awe. "Some," Elena said quietly, using the same non-committal response she had given when Thompson first asked about her field experience. "Some?" Martinez laughed, but it wasn't a mocking laugh. "Rodriguez, I've been a Marine for 12 years. I've served 3 combat deployments. What I saw you do today was not some experience. That was the performance of someone who has been there and done that more times than most of us ever will." Elena felt something tighten in her chest. This was the moment she had been dreading, when her past and present collided, and she could no longer hide behind vague answers and modest deflections. "I've had good training," she said, which was technically true, but hardly the whole story. Jackson, the youngest member of the team, was shaking his head in amazement. "Rodriguez, I don't know what your background is, but what you did today was art. Pure art. Where did you serve before this assignment?" Elena looked at Thompson, who nodded slightly, giving her permission to share what she was comfortable sharing. "Different places," Elena said finally. "Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria. Few other locations that I can't really talk about." "How many deployments?" Williams asked gently. Elena was quiet for a long moment. 6, she said finally. The number hung in the air like a physical presence. 6 combat deployments in 8 years of service was almost unheard of in the modern military. Most Marines served 1 or 2 deployments in their entire careers. 6 deployments meant Elena had spent more time in combat zones than most Marines spent on active duty. 6, Martinez repeated slowly. "Jesus, Rodriguez. 6 deployments and you're what, 26 years old? Audio, 7 next month." Elena corrected, automatically. Williams did some quick mental math. "That means you've been deploying almost continuously since you finished your initial training." Elena nodded, uncomfortable with the attention, but unable to deny the facts. "What was your job downrange?" Jackson asked. This was the question Elena had been dreading. How could she explain that she had served with special operations units, that she had been tasked with some of the most dangerous missions the military conducted, that she had been wounded repeatedly while leading other Marines into situations where the margin for error was measured in milliseconds? "Reconnaissance," she said finally, which was true but incomplete. "Just reconnaissance?" Martinez pressed. Elena looked at Thompson again, and he could see the internal struggle playing out on her face. Part of her wanted to retreat back into anonymity, to deflect the questions and return to being invisible. But another part of her, a part that had been dormant for months, was beginning to remember what it felt like to be respected as a Marine, rather than tolerated as an outsider. "Force reconnaissance," Elena said quietly. "Some special operations support." The team exchanged glances. Force reconnaissance was among the most elite units in the Marine Corps, and special operations support could mean almost anything, but all of it dangerous. "Rodriguez," Williams said slowly, "how many times have you been wounded?" This was the question Elena had hoped no one would ask. It was also the question that went to the heart of who she was as a Marine, and why she struggled so much with accepting recognition for her service. Elena looked down at her hands, which bore several small scars that most people never noticed. She thought about the larger scars hidden beneath her uniform, the ones that told the story of 10 separate occasions when she had been injured while serving her country. "A few times," she said, using the same evasive language she had been using for weeks. But Thompson decided that the time for evasion was over. "Elena," he said gently but firmly, "these Marines deserve to know who they're serving with. They deserve to know what you've sacrificed for the Corps and for the country." Elena looked up at Thompson, and he could see tears forming in her eyes. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't talk about it." "You don't have to talk about the details," Thompson said. "But these Marines have been treating you like you don't belong here, and that's not fair to you or to them. They need to understand that they're not just serving with another Marine. They're serving with a hero." "I'm not a hero," Elena said quickly, the automatic response she gave whenever anyone suggested that her service had been extraordinary. That's not your decision to make, Williams said firmly. Rodriguez, I don't know the details of what you've done or what you've been through, but I know enough to recognize that you've given more for the Corps than most of us ever will.
The question is, are you going to let us honor that, or are you going to keep pretending that it doesn't matter? Elena felt something breaking inside her chest. Not something bad, but something that had been holding her back.
For months she had been so focused on her failures, her mistakes, her guilt over the Marines who hadn't come home, that she had forgotten about the Marines who had come home because of what she had done. She thought about the 19-year-old Marine she had rescued during her last deployment, the one who was alive today because she had been willing to be shot multiple times to bring him home. She thought about the dozens of other Marines she had served with over 6 deployments, the missions that had succeeded because of her skills and leadership, the lives that had been saved because she had been willing to put herself in harm's way. 10. She said so quietly that the others had to strain to hear her.
10 what?
Martinez asked. Elena took a deep breath, and when she spoke again, her voice was stronger. 10 Purple Hearts. I've been wounded 10 times. The silence that followed was profound. 10 Purple Hearts was not just unusual, it was almost unprecedented. It meant that Elena Rodriguez had been wounded in combat 10 separate times and had either returned to duty immediately or had returned to combat as soon as her wounds healed. 10, Jackson repeated, his voice filled with awe. Elena nodded, and for the first time since arriving at Camp Pendleton, she didn't look ashamed when talking about her service. The first one was in Iraq, during my first deployment. IED blast, shrapnel in my leg and arm. I was back on patrol 3 days later. She paused, remembering. The second one was 6 months later. Same deployment. Sniper round grazed my shoulder during a firefight. That one didn't even require stitches. Elena looked around at her teammates who were listening with rapt attention. The third, fourth, and fifth were all in Afghanistan during my second deployment. Various wounds from various engagements. The 6th and 7th were during my third deployment, also Afghanistan. The 8th was in Iraq during my 4th deployment. The 9th and 10th were both during my last deployment in Syria. She stopped talking, and the silence stretched on. Finally, Martinez spoke. Rodriguez, 10 Purple Hearts means you've been wounded in combat 10 times, and all 10 times you either stayed in the fight or you came back to fight again. Elena nodded. That's not just courage, Williams added. That's dedication to your fellow Marines that goes beyond anything most of us could imagine. I wasn't being dedicated, Elena said quietly. I was just doing my job. Elena smiled slightly, the first genuine smile her teammates had seen from her. My job was to complete the mission and bring my Marines home. Sometimes that meant getting hurt. Thompson watched this exchange with profound satisfaction. For the first time since Elena had arrived at Camp Pendleton, she was talking about her service without minimizing it or apologizing for it. More importantly, her teammates were finally seeing her as she really was, not a weak link in their unit, but one of the most experienced and dedicated Marines any of them would ever serve with. But Elena's story was not finished. Tomorrow would bring the final day of competition, and with it, challenges that would test everything she had learned during her years of combat service. More importantly, it would provide an opportunity for her to finally step fully back into her role as a warrior, not despite the trauma and pain she had endured, but because of how those experiences had shaped her into someone extraordinary. The final day of the warrior competition dawned grey and windy, with weather conditions that would add another layer of complexity to what was already designed to be the most challenging event of the competition. The culminating exercise was a live-fire combat simulation that would test everything the Marines had learned about tactics, marksmanship, leadership, and decision-making under extreme pressure. Elena woke before dawn, as she had every morning for years. The habit had been formed during her deployments, when the hours before sunrise were often the safest time to move, plan, or simply think, without the immediate pressure of combat operations. But this morning was different. For the first time in months, Elena wasn't dreading the day ahead. She wasn't looking forward to it exactly, but she wasn't filled with the anxiety and self-doubt that had plagued her since arriving at Camp Pendleton. The revelation of her 10 Purple Hearts had changed something fundamental in how her teammates saw her. But more importantly, it had begun to change how she saw herself. The respectful questions they had asked the night before, the way they had listened to her brief descriptions of her wounds and recoveries, the obvious admiration in their voices when they talked about her service, all of it had reminded Elena of something she had forgotten. She was a United States Marine. Not a broken veteran struggling to find her place, not a damaged person trying to hide her past, but a Marine who had proven herself in combat more times and in more ways than most people could imagine. Elena dressed carefully in her combat uniform, checking and rechecking her equipment with the methodical precision that had kept her alive through 6 deployments. As she prepared her rifle and ammunition, muscle memory took over. Her hands moved automatically through procedures she had performed hundreds of times in places where a single mistake could mean death. By the time Elena arrived at the staging area for the final exercise, word had spread throughout the base about her performance over the previous 2 days. Marines from units not participating in the competition had come to watch, drawn by stories of the quiet staff sergeant who had achieved perfect marksmanship scores and led flawless tactical operations. The attention made Elena uncomfortable, but she was beginning to accept that some level of visibility was inevitable. More importantly, she was starting to understand that visibility didn't have to mean vulnerability. She could be seen and recognized without having to reveal more of herself than she was ready to share. Thompson gathered his team for a final briefing about the day's exercise. The scenario was complex and realistic, a joint operation involving multiple units working together to clear a fortified compound, rescue hostages, and secure intelligence materials. Each unit would be assigned a specific role, and success would depend not just on individual performance, but on coordination and communication between different teams. Elena's unit had been assigned the most dangerous role, breaching the compound's primary defensive positions and creating an opening for the other units to exploit. It was exactly the kind of mission that Elena had performed dozens of times in real combat situations, but she wondered if she was ready to step back into a leadership role under such intense scrutiny. "Rodriguez," Thompson said as the team prepared to move to their starting positions, "I want you to take point on this operation." "Staff Sergeant, are you sure? Martinez has more time in grade, and Williams has experience leading." Rodriguez Thompson interrupted. "Yesterday proved that you have more relevant experience than anyone else on this team. More importantly, this is exactly the kind of operation you've done before for real. I trust your judgment, and I need you to trust yourself." Elena nodded slowly. She could feel her teammates watching her, but their expressions showed none of the skepticism or doubt she had grown accustomed to over the past weeks. Instead, she saw confidence, respect, and perhaps most importantly, trust. "All right," Elena said, her voice taking on the tone of command that her teammates had heard the day before. "Let's review the plan one more time." As Elena briefed the operation, something remarkable happened. The transformation that had begun during the previous day's tactical exercise continued, but now it was deeper and more complete. The quiet, self-effacing woman who had endured weeks of ridicule was gone, replaced by a combat leader whose confidence and competence were unmistakable. Elena's plan was thorough and flexible, anticipating potential complications and identifying opportunities that other teams might miss. But more than that, her leadership style was exactly what the situation required. She was calm without being passive, decisive without being inflexible, and confident without being arrogant. "Questions?" Elena asked after completing her briefing. For the first time since they had been assigned to work together, none of her teammates had any questions. They understood their roles, they trusted the plan, and most importantly, they trusted Elena to lead them through whatever challenges the exercise might present. The exercise began with Elena's team in position outside the simulated compound. Around them, other Marine units were preparing for their own roles in the operation. Radio chatter filled their headsets as commanders coordinated the complex multi-unit assault. Elena listened to the communications with the trained ear of someone who had participated in dozens of similar operations under much more dangerous circumstances. She could hear the tension in some of the unit leaders' voices, the slight uncertainty that always preceded complex operations, but she felt none of that uncertainty herself. For the first time in months, Elena felt like herself again, not the broken, guilt-ridden veteran who had been struggling to find her place, but the combat Marine who had led troops through some of the most dangerous operations the military conducted. "All units, this is Control," came the voice over the radio. "Exercise is live. Execute, execute, execute." Elena keyed her radio. "Dragon 6 moving now," she said, using the call sign that had been assigned to her team. What happened over the next hour would become legendary in Marine Corps training circles. Elena led her team through the complex assault with a combination of tactical brilliance and leadership excellence that left the exercise observers struggling to find adequate superlatives. Elena's approach to clearing the compound's defensive positions was methodical but dynamic. She moved her team through the simulated enemy positions with perfect timing, using cover and concealment techniques that minimized their exposure while maximizing their effectiveness. When the exercise controllers introduced unexpected complications, simulated equipment failures, additional enemy positions, civilian complications, Elena adapted instantly, making decisions that kept the operation moving forward while protecting her teammates. But what impressed the observers most was not just Elena's tactical skill, but her leadership under extreme simulated pressure. When Lance Corporal Jackson became disoriented during a particularly complex phase of the assault, Elena's guidance was calm and precise, helping him regain his focus without breaking the momentum of the operation. When Sergeant Williams identified a potential opportunity to accelerate their timeline, Elena evaluated his suggestion quickly and incorporated it into her plan seamlessly. Most remarkably, Elena maintained constant communication with the other unit leaders, coordinating her team's actions with the broader operation in a way that maximized everyone's chances of success. Her radio transmissions were brief and clear, conveying exactly the information needed without cluttering the communications net with unnecessary chatter. As the exercise progressed, Elena found herself remembering not just the technical skills she had developed over 6 combat deployments, but the confidence and sense of purpose that had made her an effective leader in the most dangerous situations imaginable. She was still carrying the emotional weight of her combat experiences, still dealing with the guilt and trauma that had led to her assignment to administrative duties, but she was beginning to understand that those experiences had also made her into something extraordinary. The turning point in the exercise came when Elena's team encountered a situation that wasn't part of the original scenario. The exercise controllers had introduced a complication designed to test the Marines' ability to adapt under pressure, a simulated improvised explosive device that blocked their planned route to the objective. In a real combat situation, Elena would have had multiple options for dealing with such a threat, but the training environment limited her choices. She could either find an alternate route that would significantly delay the operation, or she could attempt to neutralize the simulated IED using techniques that were risky but potentially much faster. Elena studied the situation for less than 30 seconds before making her decision. "Control, this is Dragon 6, she said into her radio. "I need a simulated EOD assessment on the obstacle in our path." Dragon 6. Control. Simulated EOD assessment shows device can be neutralized, but the process carries significant risk of simulated casualties. Elena closed her eyes briefly, and for a moment she was back in Syria during her final deployment, facing a similar decision with real explosives and real consequences. On that day, she had chosen to personally neutralize the threat, accepting the risk to herself in order to keep the operation on schedule and protect her Marines from prolonged exposure to enemy fire. That decision had resulted in her 9th and 10th Purple Hearts when the device partially detonated, sending shrapnel into her chest and back. It had also allowed her team to complete their mission and return home safely. Now, faced with a simulated version of the same dilemma, Elena made the same choice she had made in real combat. Control, Dragon 6. I'm going to neutralize the device myself. Continue with the operation timeline. Elena handed her rifle to Sergeant Williams and approached the simulated IED. The exercise controllers had designed the scenario to be realistic, complete with time pressure and the possibility of simulated failure. Elena's teammates watched with growing amazement as she worked through the neutralization procedure with the calm competence of someone who had done this before under much more dangerous circumstances. As Elena worked, Corporal Martinez found himself thinking about the 10 Purple Hearts she had earned. He was beginning to understand that each of those medals represented a moment like this. 1. When Elena had been willing to put herself at risk to complete a mission or protect her fellow Marines. The simulated IED was successfully neutralized, and Elena's team resumed their assault on the compound. But word of what she had done spread quickly through the exercise communications net. Other unit leaders began requesting Elena's input on tactical decisions, recognizing that they were working with someone whose experience and judgment exceeded their own. By the time the exercise concluded, Elena had not only led her own team through a flawless assault, but had effectively become the tactical coordinator for the entire operation. Her radio had become the hub through which information flowed, and decisions were made, not because she had demanded authority, but because her competence had made her the natural leader for the complex multi-unit operation. When the final ceasefire was called and the exercise concluded, the resulting silence was profound. Marines who had participated in hundreds of training exercises stood in stunned appreciation of what they had just witnessed. Exercise controllers who had seen thousands of Marines attempt this scenario agreed that Elena's performance was among the finest they had ever observed. But Elena's transformation was not yet complete. As the various units gathered for the post-exercise debrief, She found herself facing a moment she had been dreading for months, being the center of attention in front of a large group of Marines who would want to know about her background and experience. Colonel Patricia Hayes, the base commander who had come to observe the final day of competition, approached Elena as the teams prepared for debriefing.
Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Colonel Hayes said, extending her hand. That was an exceptional performance. I've been watching military exercises for 25 years, and I can honestly say I've rarely seen anything like what you accomplished today. Elena shook the colonel's hand, fighting the urge to deflect the praise or minimize her performance. Thank you, ma'am, Elena said simply. I'm curious about your background, Colonel Hayes continued. Your service record shows recent administrative assignments, but what I witnessed today suggests considerably more experience than that would indicate. Elena glanced at Thompson, who nodded encouragingly. Ma'am, I served 6 combat deployments before my current assignment, Elena said. Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and some other locations I can't discuss in detail. 6 deployments, Colonel Hayes repeated. What was your role downrange? Force reconnaissance, ma'am? Some special operations support. Colonel Hayes's expression changed as she began to understand who she was talking to. Force reconnaissance Marines with 6 combat deployments were rare, and ones with special operations experience were even rarer. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, I think we need to have a more detailed conversation about your career and your current assignment, Colonel Hayes said. But first, I believe you have some recognition coming from this competition. The awards ceremony for the Warrior competition was held in the base auditorium, with Marines from across Camp Pendleton in attendance. Elena's team had won the overall competition by a significant margin, with Elena's individual performances setting new records in multiple categories. As Elena walked across the stage to receive her awards, she could see Thompson beaming with pride in the audience. Her teammates were applauding enthusiastically, no longer seeing her as the weak link they had initially thought her to be, but as the extraordinary Marine she had always been. But the most important moment came when Colonel Hayes took the podium to present the awards. Ladies and gentlemen, Colonel Hayes began, this year's Warrior competition has been remarkable for many reasons, but perhaps most notably for reminding us that in the Marine Corps, we should never judge our fellow Marines by appearances or preconceptions. Elena felt her heart rate increase as she realized where this speech was heading. Staff Sergeant Elena Rodriguez has demonstrated over the past 3 days that excellence in the Marine Corps comes in many forms, Colonel Hayes continued. Her performance in this competition has been exceptional by any measure, but what makes it truly remarkable is the background that she brings to her service. The auditorium grew quiet as Colonel Hayes paused. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez has served 6 combat deployments in 8 years of service, including assignments with some of our most elite units. She has been wounded in combat 10 times, earning 10 Purple Hearts, and has returned to duty after each wound to continue serving her fellow Marines and her country. The silence that followed was profound, but it was a different kind of silence than Elena had experienced before. This wasn't the uncomfortable quiet that followed awkward situations or failed expectations. This was the silence of respect, of Marines processing information about one of their own that fundamentally changed how they understood courage, sacrifice, and dedication. 10 Purple Hearts, Colonel Hayes repeated, represents a level of sacrifice and dedication that few Marines ever achieve. But more than that, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's performance over the past 3 days has demonstrated that she has not just survived her combat experiences. She has learned from them, grown from them, and become the kind of leader that every Marine deserves to serve with. The applause that followed started slowly, but built into something thunderous. Elena stood at attention, fighting back tears as hundreds of Marines rose to their feet to honor her service and sacrifice. As the applause continued, Elena found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. Months ago, she had been a broken veteran struggling with guilt, trauma, and a sense that her best days as a Marine were behind her. She had arrived at Camp Pendleton expecting to serve out her remaining time in anonymity, avoiding attention, and trying to heal from wounds that went far deeper than the physical scars she carried. But standing on that stage, receiving the recognition and respect of her fellow Marines, Elena realized that her journey was not about recovering from her past experiences. It was about integrating those experiences into a new understanding of who she was as a Marine and as a person. After the ceremony, Elena found herself surrounded by Marines who wanted to congratulate her and ask questions about her service. For the first time in months, she didn't try to escape these conversations. Instead, she answered their questions honestly, shared appropriate stories from her deployments, and began to accept that her experiences, both positive and traumatic, were part of what made her valuable as a Marine.
Late that evening, Elena sat in her room with the wooden box containing her purple hearts open on her desk. But this time, instead of seeing the medals as reminders of failure and loss, she tried to see them as Thompson and her teammates saw them, as evidence of her willingness to sacrifice for her fellow Marines and her country. Her phone rang, and she saw Dr. Chen's name on the display. "Elena," Dr. Chen said when she answered, "I got a call from Colonel Hayes. She told me about your performance in the competition and about your decision to reveal your combat history to your unit." "I'm not sure it was a decision," Elena replied. "It just seemed like it was time."
How do you feel about it, Doctor?
Chen asked. Elena considered the question carefully.
"Different," she said finally. "I feel like I've been trying to be invisible for so long that I forgot what it felt like to be seen for who I really am. And how does it feel to be seen?"
Elena smiled, the first genuinely happy smile she could remember in months.
"It feels like maybe I don't have to choose between being a Marine who has been wounded and traumatized and being a Marine who is still capable of leading and making a difference. Maybe I can be both." Dr. Chen was quiet for a moment. "Elena, that's exactly what we've been working toward. Integration, not recovery."
"Accepting that your trauma is part of your story, but not the end of your story."
After hanging up the phone, Elena carefully placed her purple hearts back in their box, but this time she didn't lock it away.
Instead, she left it open on her desk where she could see it, a reminder not of failure and loss, but of sacrifice and survival. The next morning, Elena reported for duty to find that everything had changed. The jokes and dismissive comments were gone, replaced by respectful greetings and requests for advice from Marines who now understood who they were serving with. More importantly, Elena found that she no longer dreaded each day or tried to make herself invisible. Colonel Hayes called Elena into her office that afternoon to discuss her future assignments. The conversation revealed that Elena's exceptional performance in the competition, combined with her extensive combat experience, had attracted attention at the highest levels of Marine Corps leadership. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," Colonel Hayes said, "I've received inquiries from several units about your availability for assignment. It seems that word of your capabilities has spread beyond Camp Pendleton." Elena listened as Colonel Hayes described opportunities with elite units that would put her back in a combat leadership role. A year ago, such opportunities would have terrified her. The thought of returning to the high-stress life-or-death situations that had resulted in her 10 Purple Hearts would have seemed impossible. But now, Elena found herself considering these opportunities not with fear, but with a cautious interest. She was beginning to understand that she could carry the trauma of her past experiences without being crippled by them. She could acknowledge the pain and loss she had experienced without allowing that pain to define her entire identity. "Ma'am," Elena said finally, "I'd like to stay at Camp Pendleton for a while longer. I feel like I'm still working through some things, and I think I might be more valuable helping to train the next generation of Marines than I would be going back to combat operations." Colonel Hayes smiled. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, that's exactly the kind of mature judgment I would expect from someone with your experience."
"We would be honored to have you help train our Marines, and I think they would benefit enormously from learning from someone who has proven herself as thoroughly as you have."
Over the following weeks and months, Elena settled into her role as a combat instructor and mentor.
She found that teaching other Marines the skills and judgment she had developed over 6 deployments was deeply satisfying in a way that her previous administrative assignments had never been. More importantly, Elena discovered that sharing her experiences, both positive and negative, with younger Marines helped her process her own trauma in ways that individual counseling sessions never could. When she talked to Marines about the importance of decision-making under pressure, she drew on real examples from her deployments. When she discussed the reality of combat stress and its effects, she spoke from personal experience with a credibility that no textbook could provide. Elena also found that her teammates from the competition had become genuine friends and colleagues rather than just people she served with. Thompson, Williams, Martinez, and Jackson sought out her advice on both professional and personal matters, and she began to understand what it meant to be part of a military community rather than just a Marine trying to survive each day. 6 months after the Warrior competition, Elena received a letter from the 19-year-old Marine she had rescued during her final deployment in Syria. The Marine, now stationed at Camp Lejeune, had heard about Elena's performance in the competition and wanted to thank her again for saving his life. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," the letter read, "I heard about what you did at the competition, and I wanted you to know how proud I am to have served with you. What you did for me in Syria changed my life. But more than that, the way you led our team through impossible situations taught me what it means to be a Marine. I hope someday I can be half the leader you are." Elena read the letter several times, each reading helping her understand something that had been missing from her self-perception for months. She had been so focused on the Marines who hadn't come home from her deployments that she had forgotten about the Marines who had come home because of her actions, decisions, and leadership. That evening, Elena called Dr. Chen to share the letter and discuss what it meant for her continued recovery. Elena. Dr. Chen said after listening to Elena read the letter, "This is exactly what we've been working toward. You're beginning to see your service not just through the lens of trauma and loss, but through the lens of the positive impact you've had on other Marines and the successful completion of difficult missions under impossible circumstances."
I still think about the Marines who didn't make it home, Elena said.
"I don't think I'll ever stop feeling responsible for them." "That's normal and expected," Dr. Chen replied. "The goal was never to eliminate those feelings, but to put them in context with the totality of your service. You can mourn the Marines who were lost, while also acknowledging the Marines who were saved. You can feel responsible for decisions that led to casualties while also recognizing that your leadership prevented many more casualties from occurring." As Elena settled into her new role at Camp Pendleton, she began to understand that her story was not about overcoming her past, but about integrating her past into a new understanding of who she was and who she could become. The 10 purple hearts in the box on her desk were no longer just reminders of pain and failure. They were also symbols of her willingness to sacrifice for others, her dedication to completing missions under impossible circumstances, and her refusal to quit when quitting would have been easier and safer. The quiet, self-effacing woman who had endured weeks of mockery from fellow Marines was still part of who Elena was, but she was no longer the complete picture. Elena Rodriguez was also a combat veteran, with more experience leading Marines in dangerous situations than most people could imagine. She was a mentor and instructor whose lessons were informed by real-world experience that could save lives. Most importantly, she was a Marine who had earned the right to stand proudly among warriors, not despite her scars and trauma, but because of how she had earned them and what she had accomplished in spite of them. The transformation that had begun during the warrior competition continued over the months that followed. Elena never became the loud, aggressive stereotype that some people associated with combat veterans. She remained thoughtful, measured, and careful with her words. But she also became confident in ways she had never been before. Secure in her identity as both a Marine who had been wounded and traumatized, and a Marine who had proven herself worthy of respect and admiration. A year after the competition, Elena was promoted to gunnery sergeant and assigned as the senior instructor for advanced combat leadership courses at Camp Pendleton. Her classes became legendary among Marines for their realism, their practical applicability, and their instructors' obvious credibility. When new Marines arrived at Camp Pendleton and saw Gunnery Sergeant Elena Rodriguez for the first time, they saw exactly what the Marines in her first unit had seen: a quiet, unassuming woman who looked too young and too small to be a combat veteran. But now, word of her background preceded her, and new Marines quickly learned that appearances could be deceiving. Elena's story became part of the culture at Camp Pendleton, told and retold as an example of why Marines should never judge their fellow warriors by their appearance, their size, their gender, or their reluctance to boast about their accomplishments. It became a reminder that courage comes in many forms, that leadership is not always loud or obvious, and that sometimes the most extraordinary Marines are the ones who seem most ordinary at first glance. Most importantly, Elena's story became a testament to the idea that trauma and triumph are not mutually exclusive. A Marine can carry the scars of combat, both physical and emotional, while still being an exceptional warrior and leader. The experiences that break some people can, with proper support and understanding, become the foundation for extraordinary service and inspiring leadership. Elena Rodriguez had learned to see herself not as a broken veteran trying to hide from her past, but as a complete Marine whose past experiences, both positive and traumatic, had shaped her into someone uniquely qualified to lead, teach, and inspire others. Her 10 Purple Hearts were no longer symbols of failure and loss, but evidence of her extraordinary dedication to her fellow Marines and her unwavering commitment to completing the mission, no matter the personal cost. And in a small box on her desk, those 10 Purple Hearts served as a daily reminder that sometimes the quietest Marines carry the heaviest burdens, and sometimes those who look least like warriors have proven themselves in ways that would humble the bravest among us. Just out of training, Marines ridiculed her, until her 10 Purple Hearts left them speechless.